The water ration on Arun's Rest had been cut to half a liter per person per day. Nobody announced it with sirens or emergency broadcasts. The colony administration simply posted a notice on the public board outside the distribution center, printed on plain paper, held up with 2 pins. It listed the new numbers. It did not offer an explanation, because everyone already knew the explanation. The pipes that fed the underground reservoir were pulling up less and less each week, and the Drackery shipping lane that carried their supply freighters had been sitting blocked for 17 months by a territorial dispute that no one in the Galactic Assembly had found the time to resolve. 40,000 people lived on Arun's Rest. They were farmers and teachers and mechanics and children. They had been there for 80 years, building something on a world that was not easy to build on. The soil was thin and the winds were sharp and the growing seasons were short. But they had stayed, because that is what colony people do. They stay. Now they were dying quietly, the way people die when the rest of the galaxy decides their problem is too small to prioritize. It was into this situation that Rael Davin was dispatched. He was not dispatched because anyone believed he would succeed. His supervisor at the Colonial Diplomatic Corps, a tired woman named Director Oren, had been very honest with him about that. She sat across from him in her office, her hands flat on the desk, and she said, "Rael, we need someone who can fail with dignity. The Assembly will act eventually. We just need to keep applying visible pressure until they do. You are good at being visible without making things worse." Rael had nodded. He had thanked her. He had gone home and packed a single bag, and then he had spent the next 3 nights reading every diplomatic record the Corps had ever filed on the Drackery. 40 years of records. He read all of them. He was not angry at Director Oren. She was not wrong about the situation. She was just wrong about what he intended to do with it. The transit to the edge of Drackery space took 9 days. Rael spent most of it at a small desk in his bunk compartment, not sleeping, not watching any of the entertainment feeds that the transport provided. He read. He took notes by hand because he remembered things better that way. He learned names, not just the names of council members and political factions, but the names of river systems on the Drackery homeworld, the names of bloodline disputes that went back 3,000 years, the names of the 11 Drackery who had publicly criticized the blockade policy, and the names of the ones who had publicly defended it. He filled 2 notebooks. On the 9th day, a Drackery vessel appeared on the transport sensors and ordered them to halt for boarding inspection. The Drackery vessel was approximately the size of a small mountain. The transport pilot, a man who had been flying outer routes for 20 years, still went pale when he saw it on the display. Rael looked at it through the viewport for a long moment. He had known intellectually that Drackery ships were enormous. Seeing it was different from knowing it. He took a slow breath, let it out, and went back to his notes. The inspection team that came aboard moved through the transport with the particular boredom of beings who do something 1,000 times and stop seeing it. They were not cruel. They were simply indifferent, the way a river is indifferent to a stone it passes over. One of them paused at the door of Rael's compartment and looked at him with large amber eyes that contained, as far as Rael could tell, no particular emotion at all. Rael looked back. He did not look away. He did not smile nervously. He just looked back, quietly, the way he would look at anything he was trying to understand. The inspector moved on. His shuttle was taken aboard the Drackery vessel an hour later. His quarters were a small room with a ceiling high enough for a Drackery child, which meant it was about 3 times taller than Rael needed. There was a sleeping surface and a desk and a light. A functionary with formal neck markings appeared at the door and informed him that the High Council would grant him an audience in 6 days. The functionary did not ask if this was acceptable. He stated it and left. Rael unpacked his bag. He placed his notebooks on the desk. He looked at the room for a moment, noting the layout, the ventilation points, the direction the corridor ran outside. Then he went for a walk. He was stopped almost immediately by a Drackery warrior who had clearly been assigned to watch him and had not expected the assignment to require any actual effort this quickly. The warrior was young by Drackery standards, which meant he was somewhere around 2 or 3 centuries old. He had dark green scales with gold edging and an expression that communicated, very clearly, that guarding a human was the least interesting thing he had ever been asked to do. Rael looked up at him. The warrior was about 4 meters tall. Rael said, in reasonably good Drackery formal dialect, I was hoping to see more of the ship, if that is permitted. I find I understand situations better when I have walked through them. The warrior stared at him. My name is Rail Davin, Rail said. I did not catch your name from the assignment roster. The warrior said, after a pause that contained several kinds of surprise. Keth. Keth, Rail repeated. He nodded once, the way he would acknowledge any name worth remembering. Thank you. I will try not to make this difficult. Keth said nothing, but he did not send Rail back to his room. He turned and walked, slowly enough for Rail to keep up, and Rail followed, looking at everything, missing nothing. Outside the thick viewports of the corridor, the stars moved slowly past. Somewhere behind them, 9 days of travel away, 40,000 people were measuring water by the half-liter. Rail kept walking and kept looking. He had 6 days before the council would see him. 6 days was enough time to learn a great deal, if a person was willing to pay attention. He was willing. 6 days on a Dracari warship teaches a person things that no record or archive can. Rail learned that the ship's crew ate twice a day, in complete silence, because Dracari tradition held that mealtime was for the body and the body did not require conversation. He learned that the lowest-ranked crew members cleaned the observation decks by hand, using long brushes that had changed in design almost nothing in 4,000 years, because there were ways of doing things that were simply not questioned. He learned that Keth, his assigned guard, had a habit of standing near the forward viewports during off-duty hours and watching the stars with an expression that was very hard to name. Not longing, exactly. Something older than longing. He did not point this out to Keth. He simply noticed it. He spent the 6 days doing what he had done on the transport, walking, listening, asking questions that seemed too small to be threatening. He asked a maintenance worker about the alloy used in the corridor floors. He asked a junior functionary about the history of the ship's name. He asked Keth, on the 3rd day, what the gold edging on his scales meant in terms of his family bloodline. Keth had looked at him for a long time before answering. It means my line has produced 3 council speakers in 4 generations, he said. It means a great deal is expected of me. That sounds heavy, Rail said. Keth had no answer for that. He was quiet for the rest of the walk. On the morning of the 6th day, Rail was escorted to a preparation chamber and informed that formal dress was required for council audiences. The formal dress options available for a human being were, understandably, limited on a Dracari warship. Rail put on the cleanest version of his diplomatic uniform, made sure his notebooks were in his interior pocket, and waited. The council chamber was reached through a corridor that was half a kilometer long and completely straight. Rail walked it alone, with Keth behind him, and he used the time to breathe slowly and think about the 40,000 people on Arun's Rest, and specifically about the notice on the public board with its 2 pins, and specifically about what it meant that a civilization capable of building ships the size of mountains had decided that notice was not their problem to solve. The chamber doors opened. The space inside was so large that it had its own weather. The ceiling was lost in a faint haze of atmospheric moisture high above. The walls were carved from floor to apex with the recorded lineages of every Dracari bloodline that had ever held a seat on the council, which meant the carvings were 11,000 years old at their highest point and still being added to at the bottom. 47 dragons sat on a curved dais that was itself larger than most buildings on Arun's Rest. Their scales caught the light in colors that ranged from deep black to pale silver, and their combined age, if someone had taken the trouble to add it up, would have been somewhere around 90,000 years. A functionary announced Rail's name and his purpose. The announcement echoed for several seconds after it ended. Rail walked to the center of the chamber. He stood there for a moment, looking up at the dais, looking at the 47 faces that were looking back at him, in the way that something very large looks at something very small before deciding whether it is worth the attention. He reached into his jacket and took out a single folded document. He walked to the nearest point of the dais and placed the document on the floor, flat and open. He straightened up. Then he said, in formal Dracari dialect, speaking clearly and without hurry, I am told the Dracari do not permit unnecessary death within their sphere of influence. I am asking you to look at this and tell me whether you consider this necessary. He stepped back. He folded his hands. He waited. The silence that followed was not the silence of a room where nothing is happening. It was the silence of a room where 47 minds are processing something they did not expect. Council Speaker Vorith moved first. He was the second most powerful dragon on the council, dark blue with silver at his jaw. And he had the particular manner of a being who had spent centuries making other beings feel that their presence was an imposition. This audience was granted for the purpose of the Arun boundary dispute, he said. We have not agreed to review human administrative documents. The document is a mortality report, Rail said. It is not administrative. It is a record of people who have died and people who will die, on a schedule that I can predict with reasonable accuracy if the current situation does not change. I am not asking you to sign it. I am asking you to look at it. Vorith opened his mouth. He did not speak, because Sovereign Drain, who had been sitting at the center of the dais without moving, made a gesture with one hand that was very small and carried the complete weight of 4,000 years of authority behind it. Vorith closed his mouth. Drain had already read the document. His eyes had moved across it in the 2 seconds after Rail had placed it on the floor. He was 4,000 years old. He had learned to read very quickly because he had discovered that most beings spoke much more slowly than they thought. He looked at Rail. His eyes were the color of deep amber, and they were very calm. Why did you not petition the Galactic Assembly, he said. The Assembly takes 11 months to acknowledge a petition, Rail said. I have perhaps 4 months before the mortality rate on Arun's rest becomes unrecoverable. I came to the authority with the power to act. That is you. The chamber became very loud for a period of approximately 90 seconds. Rail stood without moving through all of it. Then a voice spoke from the far end of the dais, thin and very dry, and carrying in it the particular quality of something that has been around long enough to be unhurried about everything. I would like to be recognized. The chamber quieted. Even Vorith quieted. Because the voice belonged to Elder Saven, and Elder Saven had not spoken in a council session in 14 years, and when she chose to speak it was generally because something had happened that was worth the effort of words. She was the oldest dragon on the council, and possibly the oldest living Dracary, though no one had verified this because she had stopped discussing her age sometime in the last millennium. She was pale as old ash, and her eyes had gone cloudy with age, but there was something behind them that had not dimmed at all. She looked at Rail from across the chamber for a long moment. Let him stay, she said. I want to watch him. The council voted. It was not a comfortable vote. 14 members opposed. 8 abstained. 25 voted to allow Rail extended access to Drain KL for continued negotiations. The water blockade was not lifted. Nothing concrete had been resolved. But Rail walked out of that chamber with a foothold, which was more than anyone had sent him here to achieve. Behind him, Keth fell into step, quiet as always. But something in how he moved was different. Rail did not comment on it. He filed it away in the same place he filed everything. In his jacket pocket, his notebook was already open to a fresh page. There is a kind of person who, when given time they did not expect to have, fills it with noise. Meetings, messages, visible effort, motion that can be pointed to and called progress. Rail was not that kind of person. He was given 6 weeks on Drain KL with no scheduled negotiations, no formal agenda, and no concrete progress on the water crisis. The council had agreed to let him stay. That was all they had agreed to. In the language of diplomatic maneuvering, this was the equivalent of being told to sit quietly in a corner until something changed. Rail sat, quietly, in a great many corners. Drain KL was a planet that had been lived on for so long that it had forgotten what it looked like before people arrived. The cities were not built so much as they were grown over centuries, one structure into another, stone and metal and older materials whose names did not translate into any human language. The streets were wide enough for Dracary to move through comfortably, which meant they were enormously wide by human standards, and Rail walked them every day without looking lost, because he had learned the layout in the first week and committed it to memory in the way he committed everything, completely and without apparent effort. He visited the public archives. He spent 3 days reading historical records about the formation of the territorial boundary that covered Arun's rest, finding 4 separate moments in the last 200 years where the boundary question could have been resolved cleanly and was not, and writing very precise notes about why each opportunity had failed. He visited craftspeople who worked in the old Dracary tradition of scale carving and asked them about their materials and their methods. He attended a public session of the lower council, which handled civil matters and which was considerably less formal than the High Council. and he sat in the observation area for 4 hours listening to a dispute about ancestral water rights in one of KL's oldest river districts. He found this last one very interesting. Keth accompanied him everywhere because that was his assignment. For the first 10 days, Keth did this with the attitude of a being who is being made to do something beneath him and knows it, but has no legitimate grounds for complaint. He walked behind Rail. He stood by doors. He answered questions in the shortest possible way. Then Rail asked him about the river district dispute. Not about the politics of it. About the specific river. About what it was called before the naming conventions changed 8 centuries ago, and whether the old name was still used by anyone. Keth knew the answer. The old name was used by the bloodlines that had lived in that district since before the current political structure existed. His own bloodline's ancestral territory was 3 districts north of there. He had heard the name from his grandmother, who was 900 years old and still alive and lived in that territory, and had opinions about the council's handling of water rights that she expressed at significant volume whenever the topic arose. Rail listened to all of this. He asked a follow-up question about the grandmother. Then another. Keth found, somewhere around the 3rd week, that he had told Rail things about his family and his bloodline history and his own complicated feelings about being assigned to a warrior role his family expected him to excel in. Things he had not told anyone, not because they were secret, but because nobody had thought to ask. "You are very strange," Keth said to him one evening, as they walked back from the lower city along a road that ran beside an ancient canal system. "Probably," Rail agreed. "You do not behave the way I expected a human diplomat to behave." Rail looked at the canal. The water was very clear. "How did you expect me to behave?" "Urgently," Keth said. "You have people dying. You have a deadline. You should be pushing harder, demanding more audiences, making the situation visible." "I am making the situation visible," Rail said. "By visiting craftspeople and sitting in civil court sessions?" "By learning," Rail said. "There is a difference between pushing and understanding. If I push without understanding, I will push in the wrong direction and make things worse. I have seen 40 years of core records where that is exactly what happened." He paused. "Also, the craftspeople were genuinely interesting. The scale carving technique they use in the North City is 3,000 years old and almost nothing like the Southern technique. I had not expected that." Keth was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You actually found that interesting?" "Yes." "You were not gathering intelligence. You were just curious." "Both things can be true at the same time," Rail said. Keth had no answer for that either. What Rail was seeing and not saying out loud was a civilization in the early stages of a very old kind of crisis. The Dracari were not declining in any dramatic sense. Their military was unmatched, their political reach was vast, their history was longer than most species had been alive. But there were fractures, visible to anyone who spent 6 weeks looking closely enough without an agenda. The birth rate among Dracari had dropped steadily for 1,000 years. Young Dracari were leaving the homeworld in greater numbers each generation, pulled toward the outer territories where council authority was thinner and expectations were lighter. The High Council itself was divided between Drain's cautious faction and Voritha's expansionist faction, and the division was not new. It was the latest expression of an argument that had been going on for centuries without resolution. Vorith believed that order required constant assertion, that the Dracari had built their civilization by being stronger than everything around them, and maintaining that civilization required maintaining that strength visibly, loudly, without apology. He looked at the outer human colonies and saw a slow encroachment that would compound if left unaddressed. Rail had read enough of his public statements to understand him completely and to feel something that was not quite pity but was in the same neighborhood. The political crisis arrived on a quiet evening in the 5th week, in the form of a message to Rail's quarters informing him that the council had passed a motion to begin formal annexation proceedings for 3 outer human colony systems. The motion had been put forward by Voritha's faction. It had passed by 2 votes. Under annexation, the colonists would become Dracari subjects with certain protected rights, which technically resolved their immediate survival problems, but ended human sovereignty in that region permanently. It was a surgical move. It made the problem disappear while simultaneously expanding Dracari territorial control. Rail read the message. He sat with it for a while. He thought about 40,000 people who had been building something for 80 years. He thought about the kind of people who stayed on difficult worlds because they believed in what they were making. He thought about thin soil and sharp winds and short growing seasons and what it means to endure those things willingly. Then he thought about Vorith and the 900-year-old grandmother and the craftspeople in the North City and the water rights dispute in the Old River District that was still being argued in civil court after centuries. He thought about what he had learned. He opened his notebook to a fresh page and started writing. He wrote for 3 hours without stopping. When he was done, he sent a request through Keth to the sovereign's office. He asked for a private audience with Drain, not with the council, with Drain alone. There was no precedent for this. A non-Dracari requesting a private audience with the sovereign outside of formal council proceedings was simply not something that had ever been attempted, because it was not something anyone had ever thought worth trying. Drain granted it. When Keth delivered the confirmation, there was something in his expression that Rael had not seen there before. It was not surprise. It was closer to recognition, the look of someone who is watching a pattern complete itself and only now understanding what the pattern was. Rael thanked him, put his notebook in his jacket pocket, and went to sleep. He had learned everything he needed to learn. Now it was time to use it. Drain's private audience chamber was nothing like the High Council Hall. There were no carved lineages on the walls, no vaulted ceilings designed to remind visitors of their smallness. The room was large by practical necessity, because Drain was large, but it was not large in the way that was meant to communicate power. It held a wide, flat table, several shelves of physical records and formats that ranged from paper scrolls to materials Rael had no name for, and one tall window that looked out over the ancient city of the homeworld, where the evening light was turning everything a shade of dull copper. Keth was at the door. He had been told to stand outside, which had produced a look of visible conflict on his face, because his assignment was to watch Rael, and standing outside a closed door made that technically impossible. Rael had told him quietly, as they walked the corridor, that he would be fine. Keth had said nothing, but he had stood outside the door without further argument. Drain was already in the room when Rael entered. He did not sit in the way that made visitors look up to him. He was simply present, standing near the window, and when Rael came in he turned and looked at him with those deep amber eyes that had seen more of the galaxy's history than any archive Rael had ever read. "You requested this," Drain said. "Not an accusation. A plain fact. An invitation to begin." Rael stood in the center of the room. He did not have his notebook out, because he had decided that this conversation needed to be done without notes, without the appearance of documentation, without anything that put distance between two people talking honestly. "I know about the annexation motion," Rael said. "I know it passed. I know what it means for the people on Arun's Rest." He paused. "I am not here to argue against it." Drain was quiet. This was, clearly, not what he had expected. "I am here," Rael continued, "because I have spent 6 weeks on this world, and I have learned a great many things, and I have not used any of them. And I want you to know that. Not as a bargaining position, not as a way of saying you owe me something. I want you to know it because I think it matters that you understand what I could have done and did not do." He said it plainly, without drama. He explained it the way he would explain a field observation, clearly, specifically. He named the fractures in the council, the division between Drain's faction and Vorith's, the 3 bloodlines whose support for Vorith was financial rather than ideological, and who could be separated from him with the right kind of quiet pressure. The 2 members of the High Council who had voted for the annexation motion, but who had histories of opposing Vorith on territorial matters and whose votes, Rael suspected, had been obtained through means that would not survive close scrutiny. He named all of it, calmly, in the right order. Then he said, "I am not going to use any of that. I want to be clear. I have not used it in 6 weeks, and I am not going to use it now, because playing factions against each other might get my colony a short-term result and guarantee a long-term disaster. I am telling you what I know so that you understand that I had options. I made a choice not to take them." The room was very quiet. Drain moved away from the window. He sat on the edge of the wide table in a way that brought his face closer to Rael's level, which Rael recognized as a deliberate choice. He was 4,000 years old, and he did not do anything by accident. "I know what you did not do," Drain said. "I have been watching you since the first council session. Elder Savan asked me what I saw in you. I told her I was not certain yet." He paused. "I am certain now." He reached behind him, onto the table, and brought forward something that Rael had not seen when he entered the room. It was a circlet, not large, made of a metal that was neither gold nor silver, but somewhere between, and it was covered in engravings so fine they were almost invisible. It was very old. Everything about it communicated age, not the age of something worn out, but the age of something that had been carefully kept. "Do you know what this is?" Drain asked. Rael looked at it. "No," he said, which was true. "It is called the Dragon Crown," Drain said. "It is not a crown of rulership. It does not make anyone a king or a sovereign or a commander. It is an acknowledgement, the highest acknowledgement the Dracari can make." He set it on the table between them. "There is a concept in our language, Dreven. It has no clean translation into any human dialect I have encountered. It means, approximately, the wisdom to know what should not be done and the will to not do it. Not restraint from weakness, not restraint from fear, restraint from understanding." He looked at Rael. "We have offered this acknowledgement 9 times in 11,000 years. Every being who received it took it. Most of them deserved it." Rael looked at the crown. He did not touch it. "I am offering it to you," Drain said. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of something important being thought about properly. Rael looked at the crown for a long time. Then he looked at Drain. Then he said, "No." Drain did not move. He waited. "If I take this," Rael said, "it becomes about me. The 40,000 people on Arun's Rest stop being a moral problem for the Dracari and start being a political symbol of my status. Every decision the Council makes about those people going forward will be filtered through the question of what it means for the human who holds the Dragon Crown. The situation becomes more complicated, not less. People who are already dying slowly will keep dying slowly while the complications are negotiated." He met Drain's eyes directly. "I came here to solve a water crisis. I will accept a solution. I will not accept a crown." Drain looked at him for a very long time. The kind of time that only beings who have lived for millennia can sit with without discomfort. Then Sovereign Drain, for 1,000 years old, High Lord of the Dracari, the most powerful single being in the known galaxy, lowered his head. Not a kneel. Not yet. A lowering of the head that in Dracari tradition meant something specific and significant, and that Rael, who had read extensively, recognized immediately. It was the gesture given to those who have demonstrated Dreven. It was not offered casually. It was not offered politically. It was offered because it was true. "You have just proven," Drain said, his voice carrying something that might have been, in a 4,000-year-old dragon, the closest thing to wonder, "that you deserve it more than anyone who has ever been offered it, including my predecessors, including me." He was quiet for a moment. "The annexation motion will not be implemented, not because of leverage or political maneuvering, because it is wrong. I should have stopped it before the vote, and I did not, and that is a failure I will correct." He straightened. "The water blockade will be lifted tonight. Supply freighters will be cleared for the Arun's Rest shipping lane by morning." Rael felt something move through him that he did not show on his face. He thought about the notice on the public board, the 2 pins, the half-liter ration. He breathed once, slowly, and kept his expression calm. "Thank you," he said. Just those 2 words. He meant them completely. He picked up his notebook as he left, because he had left it near the door when he came in, and he paused in the doorway and looked back once. Drain was still looking at the dragon crown on the table, with an expression that Rael filed away carefully, because it was the expression of someone who has just understood something important and is still working through what it changes. Outside the door, Keth was waiting. He had clearly been listening, because his posture was different from how it was before, not relaxed, but settled, as if something that had been slightly wrong inside him had moved into a correct position. Rael walked past him and headed back toward his quarters. "You refused the crown," Keth said, falling into step behind him. "Yes," Rael said. Keth said nothing else for the rest of the walk, but he stayed very close, closer than his assignment required, in the way that a person stays close to something they have decided they are not going to let out of their sight. Vorith found out about the blockade being lifted at roughly the same time the first supply freighter cleared Dracari territorial space. He did not shout. He did not overturn furniture or summon subordinates to berate. He was too old and too controlled for any of that. What he did was send 11 messages in rapid succession to 11 different members of the High Council, and the content of those messages, while formally polite, made it very clear that the sovereign had acted unilaterally on a matter of territorial policy without council approval, and that this could not be permitted to stand. By the next morning, Vorith had filed a formal motion of censure against Drang. It was the first censure motion against a sovereign in 600 years. The political world of Drain KL had not seen anything like it in living memory, and the living memory of the Drackery was very long. It did not cause panic, because very little caused panic in a civilization this old, but it produced a kind of vibration in the political atmosphere, a hum of attention, a collective leaning in, that Rael noticed immediately. He did not insert himself. He did not make statements. He requested, through the appropriate channels, confirmation that his travel clearance to remain on Drain KL was still active. He filed the confirmation and went back to his day. What Vorith did next was more precise and more damaging. He went after Keth. The argument he used was an old one, available in Drackery legal tradition under a category of judgment that had not been formally invoked in over 2 centuries, contamination of conduct. It held that a Drackery warrior who had been in sustained close contact with a being of significantly different values and behavioral patterns could be considered compromised in their judgment and reliability. The original intent of the rule had been practical. It was written during a war period to address the question of soldiers who had spent too long in occupied territories. Using it against a guard who had spent 6 weeks escorting a diplomat was, legally, a stretch. But Vorith had spent centuries navigating Drackery law, and he knew which stretches would hold weight. The ruling came through a secondary council panel. It was not announced in any great public forum. It was simply entered into the record, and Keth's warrior rank was stripped from him, formally and permanently, in a short ceremony in one of the public squares of the lower city, attended by a handful of observers who did not know exactly what they were watching until it was over. Rael found out from a junior functionary who delivered the news in the manner of someone who expected the human to react with alarm. Rael thanked the functionary, closed the door of his quarters, and sat for a while. He thought about Keth. He thought about the gold edging on green scales, and a 900-year-old grandmother in the Northern Territory, and a young dragon who had told him things he had not told anyone, because nobody had ever thought to ask. Then he left his quarters, walked to the public square where the ceremony had taken place, and sat down on the stone steps outside it. Keth was still there. He had not left. He was sitting against the far wall of the square, very still, in the way that something large sits when it is trying to take up as little space as possible. He looked at Rael when Rael sat down on the steps. He said nothing. Rael said nothing either. He sat there. That was all. He did not speak to the scattered Drackery who passed through the square and recognized what had happened there. He did not address the 2 information correspondents who arrived within the hour and positioned themselves at the edge of the square waiting for him to do or say something they could report. He did not send any messages. He did not take out his notebook. He just sat on the steps of the public square where his friend had been publicly humiliated, in a planet city full of beings 4 times his size and 10 times his age, and he refused to leave. He was still there when the light changed. Still there when it grew cold. Keth brought him water at some point in the evening without saying why, and Rael drank it and said thank you, and they sat together in the dark and said almost nothing, which was fine, because the sitting itself was already saying everything. By the second day, something was happening that had no name in Drackery political vocabulary. Drackery began appearing in the square, not in organized groups, not with any coordinated announcement. They came individually, at different times, with no apparent communication between them. An elderly female with bronze scales who turned out to be a civil records keeper from the North Quarter. A young male in the uniform of a lower council administrative assistant. 2 warriors, still in rank markings, who stood near the south wall and did not speak, but also did not leave. A craftsperson Rael recognized from his visits in the 3rd week, who set down his tools and simply stood, with his arms at his sides, looking at nothing in particular. By the 3rd day, there were 47 of them. None of them explained themselves when approached. The information correspondents tried. When they asked the civil records keeper why she had come, she looked at the square for a moment and said, "I saw the footage of the first day. I found I needed to be here." When they asked one of the warriors, he said only, "This is the correct place to be." When they asked the craftsperson, he looked confused by the question, as if they had asked him why he breathed. In Vorith's offices, the censure motion was encountering problems. 11 of his key council supporters had quietly withdrawn their names from it without giving formal explanations. When each was contacted separately and asked why, they gave different answers. One said he had concerns about procedural timing. One said she needed to review the territorial precedents further. One said simply that he had changed his mind. But 3 of them, when pressed, said something that Vorith could not categorize or strategize against. They said that they had gone to look at the square, and something had shifted in them, and they were not sure yet what it meant, but they knew it meant they could not put their name on a document meant to punish the sovereign for acting as a sovereign should act. On the morning of the 4th day, the warrior caste, which had not petitioned anything unanimously in the recorded history of the Drakkari, filed a formal collective petition for the restoration of Keth's rank. The petition cited no political arguments. It cited no legal frameworks. It cited conduct. A list, compiled by the warrior caste's own internal historians in the space of 3 days, of every interaction between Keth and the human diplomat that had been observed or recorded. The petition stated that the listed conduct demonstrated no contamination. It demonstrated, in the judgment of the warrior caste, the opposite. It was accepted. Keth's rank was restored the following morning. Vorith's censure motion collapsed quietly, without a vote, because it no longer had the support to pass. He did not concede publicly. He withdrew the motion on a procedural technicality and said nothing further about it, because he was too skilled to fight a battle he had already lost. Rail was back in his quarters when he heard. He was writing his field notes, because he had been doing that every evening for 6 weeks. He noted the restoration of Keth's rank in a single short sentence, and then he noted, below it, something that was not a political observation but that he felt belonged in the record. That 47 Drakkari had come and stood in a square for 3 days without being asked to, and that he had not fully understood while it was happening what he was seeing, but that he thought he understood it now. He wrote, "They were not standing for me. They were standing for the idea that some things are simply right. I think they had been waiting, without knowing it, for a reason to stand for something. I happened to be the reason that was available." He closed the notebook. He looked at the window. Outside, the ancient city of Drankael was settling into another evening. Copper light on old stone, everything still and enormous and very quiet. He started packing. Rail had asked, specifically and in writing, that his departure not be a ceremony. He had submitted the request through the appropriate diplomatic channel 4 days before his scheduled transit. He had used polite language and given a clear reason. He had a connecting transit to catch, and ceremonies created scheduling complications. He had signed it with his full name and his core identification number, because he was a careful person and careful people completed paperwork correctly even when they were leaving a planet they were glad to be leaving. The request was acknowledged. He was informed that his departure would be a standard diplomatic transit. No ceremony. He arrived at the departure platform with his single bag and his 2 notebooks. He had filled a third during his time on Drankael, at exactly the time his transit documentation specified. The platform was a wide stone space open to the early morning sky, built at the top of one of the city's oldest structures. The light was the pale gray gold of early dawn on this part of the homeworld, and the city spread out below in every direction, enormous and ancient, and still mostly quiet. Every member of the High Council was standing on the platform. All 47 of them, not in formal array, not in the rank positioning used for official functions. Simply standing there, in the early morning, as if they had happened to be on this platform for their own reasons and were not going to explain themselves. Rail stopped when he saw them. He stood with his bag in his hand, and he looked at 47 of the oldest and most powerful beings in the known galaxies standing in the gray gold dawn light, and he said nothing, because there was nothing immediately adequate to say. Drain was at the front. He was holding the dragon crown, not offering it. He held it at his side, visible, present, with no gesture of extension toward Rail. His expression was not the expression of someone performing a political act. It was the expression of someone doing something true. "We are not giving you this," Drain said. His voice carried easily in the morning quiet, low and even, the voice of someone who has had 4,000 years to learn how to say difficult things simply. "We simply want you to see that we have it, and that we considered giving it to you, and that your refusal of it is the reason we are all here." Rail looked at the crown. He looked at Drain. He looked at the 46 other members of the High Council standing in the early morning without having been officially summoned, without a ceremony scheduled, without anything requiring their presence except the fact that they had chosen to come. Then Sovereign Drain knelt. It was not a collapse. It was not a gesture of defeat. It was the specific, deliberate motion of something very large and very powerful choosing, with complete awareness of what it was doing, to lower itself. One knee on the stone of the departure platform, his great head brought level with the eyes of the small human in front of him, the dragon crown held in one hand at his side. And every dragon on that platform knelt with him. Not immediately, not as a wave. One by one, each in their own moment, each making their own choice. The ancient bronze female, the silver-jawed member from the outer council territories, the young ones and the old ones and the ones who had voted against Rael in the first council session and the ones who had voted for him. Keth, who was standing at the edge of the platform not in a guard position but as himself, knelt last. And when he did, he looked at Rael with an expression that was so open and so uncomplicated that Rael had to look somewhere else for a moment. He looked at the city, at the old stone and the canal lines and the distant mountain ridges and the sky that was getting lighter by degrees. He breathed. He said, to Drain, to all of them, simply, "Thank you." It was the same thing he had said in the private chamber. The same two words. He meant them the same way, completely, without performance, because they were the correct words and he did not feel the need to find better ones. He picked up his bag, which he had set down without noticing, and he walked to the transit vessel, and he did not look back, because looking back would have been too much, and he was aware that he was very close to his limit of what he could hold steady inside himself without it showing. The footage of that morning was transmitted by 3 different sources who had been present on the platform. It was not Rael who transmitted it. It went out across every communications network that connected to Dracarys space, which meant, within hours, every network in the known galaxy. The response was not what the people who sent it expected. There was no triumph from human political factions, no crisis declarations from the Dracary diplomatic corps, no commentary from the Galactic Assembly, which was still reviewing 4-month-old petition paperwork on matters that had already resolved themselves. What happened instead was much harder to measure and much more permanent. The footage was watched in silence by a very large number of people and beings across a very large number of worlds, and many of them felt something shift inside them that they did not have clean language for, and that feeling did not go away when they stopped watching. On a Transport 6 systems from Drain KL, Ambassador Lessa Oren watched the footage on a small screen and cried in a way she had not cried since the day her youngest child was born. Not sad, not triumphant, just overwhelmed by something true happening in front of her eyes. On Arun's rest, the first water supply freighter broke atmosphere and began its descent on the same day the footage reached the outer colony networks. Nobody had planned that timing. It was a coincidence of logistics and route clearances. It did not matter. The people on Arun's rest watched both things on the same day, and the combination of those two things was something they would tell stories about for a very long time. On Drain KL, after Rael's transit vessel had cleared orbit, Keth went to find Elder Saven. He found her in her usual place in the archive district, in a reading room full of records older than most civilizations. She was not reading. She was sitting in the morning light coming through the tall windows, doing nothing in particular, in the way that very old beings sometimes do nothing and make it look like the most important thing happening anywhere. Keth sat near her. He asked her about the dragon crown. Not about the ceremony that had just happened, but about the full history of it. Every being who had ever been offered it, and every reason they had accepted, and what had happened to them after. Saven told him. She had the history perfectly, because she had been alive for most of it. She told him about the 9 who had received it, their names, their civilizations, their reasons, and what the crown had meant for each of them. She told him about the first offering 11,000 years ago, and about the last one 3 centuries past, and about all the ones between. When she finished, Keth asked her the question that had been sitting in him all morning, since he had knelt on the departure platform and watched Rael walk away with his one bag and his notebooks. Why did no one ever refuse it before? Saven was quiet for a while. The light through the windows moved slowly across the floor. Outside, the city was fully awake now, going about the 10,000-year-old business of being itself. Because no one else ever wanted something more than the power to take it, she said. She paused. Every other being we offered it to had reached the limits of what they could achieve on their own. The crown was the next thing. It was the larger version of what they already wanted. She was quiet again. Rael wanted the water restored. That was the whole of it. The crown was not the next thing. It was a distraction from the only thing. She turned and looked at Keth, her cloudy old eyes finding him with complete precision. That is what humans are, she said. Or at least, that is what this one was. I confess I have been waiting most of my life to see it, and I am glad I was patient. Keth sat with that for a long time. On the transit vessel, somewhere in the space between Drain KL and the connecting route, Rael sat at his small desk and wrote his field report. It was detailed and clinical and used no dramatic language. It documented the negotiation outcomes, the political structure of the Dracari Council, the restoration of the water supply route, the collapse of the annexation motion, and his recommendations for continued diplomatic engagement. He documented Vortha's faction and its likely future direction. He documented the fractures in the council and the generational pressures on the Dracari civilization. He was thorough. He was precise. At the very end, under a section he labeled additional observations, he wrote one paragraph. He wrote, "The Dracari are not so different from us. They simply had longer to forget that strength without restraint is just weight. They are remembering now, I think. The process is slow and it will not be without difficulty. But they are remembering. We should help them." He read it back once. He left it in. He submitted the report, turned off the desk light, and went to sleep. He slept very well. He had not slept well in a long time, and now he did, because the 40,000 people on Arun's Rest had water, and the dragons of the oldest civilization in the known galaxy were, for the first time in centuries, asking themselves what they were for. It was, in his professional judgment, a reasonable start.